In the spring of 1525, the fields of southern Germany were not green with harvest. They were dark with smoke, blood, and broken bodies. Villages that had stood for centuries burned in a single afternoon. Churches were smashed open, their bells torn down and melted for weapons. And across the countryside, tens of thousands of ordinary men, farmers, millers, shepherds, craftsmen, marched beneath crude banners stitched from linen and sackcloth. They were poorly armed, badly trained, and hopelessly outmatched. Yet they believed, with absolute conviction, that God, justice, and history itself were finally on their side. Within weeks, nearly 60,000 of them would be dead. Facing them were fewer than 4,000 professional soldiers, armored knights, mercenaries, and disciplined cavalry under the command of the princes of the Holy Roman Empire. The imbalance was staggering. This was not a battle. It was not even a war in the modern sense. And it would become one of the bloodiest internal conflicts in European history before the French Revolution. This is the story of how desperation turned into rebellion, how faith turned into fury, and how medieval power crushed hope with steel and fire. To understand why 60,000 peasants were willing to rise up against knights who had ruled them for generations, we have to step into the world of early 16th century Germany, a land technically united under the Holy Roman Empire, but in reality shattered into hundreds of small territories ruled by princes, bishops, abbots, and imperial cities. For the peasantry, life had been growing steadily worse for decades. Feudal obligations multiplied, rents increased. Old communal rights, hunting, fishing, gathering wood, were stripped away and turned into punishable crimes. Forests that peasants had used freely for centuries were suddenly declared private property. Rivers were fenced. Mills were monopolized. Even marriage and inheritance required permission and payment. The peasants were not ignorant of these injustices. They felt them every day in empty stomachs and aching backs. But what made the situation explosive was something new, something revolutionary. Ideas. In 1517, Martin Luther had challenged the Catholic Church itself. His writings spread like wildfire, thanks to the printing press. For the first time, peasants heard sermons that spoke of Christian freedom, of spiritual equality, of a God who did not necessarily stand with kings and bishops. Although Luther himself never intended to incite social revolution, many peasants heard something radical in his message. If all Christians were equal before God, why were they treated like animals by earthly lords? If Scripture was the ultimate authority, where did the princes get the right to crush them? By 1524, unrest simmered across the German lands. Peasant bands began forming in Swabia, Franconia, Thuringia, and Alsace. At first, their demands were astonishingly moderate. They did not call for the abolition of nobility. They did not demand to overthrow the empire. Instead, they compiled a document that would become famous as the 12 Articles of the Peasants, a list of grievances grounded not in radical ideology, but in Christian morality. They asked for the right to choose their own pastors. They demanded fair rents, an end to serfdom, and the restoration of traditional communal rights. They even pledged obedience to authority, so long as that authority ruled justly. For a brief moment, history balanced on a knife's edge. Had the princes negotiated, Germany might have entered a new era peacefully. Instead, they chose violence. As spring approached, tensions snapped. Armed peasant armies, some numbering in the tens of thousands, swept through the countryside. Monasteries were burned. Records of debts and obligations were destroyed in bonfires, symbolic acts of liberation that terrified the ruling class. To the peasants, these were acts of justice. To the nobility, they were proof that order itself was under attack. And so the princes did what European elites had always done when threatened from below. They hired professionals. At the center of the counterattack stood the Swabian League, an alliance of princes, cities, and bishops, with access to trained mercenaries known as landsknechts. These were veterans of Italian wars, men hardened by years of slaughter, disciplined in formation fighting, and armed with pikes, swords, artillery, and cavalry support. They were commanded by experienced nobles like Georg Truchsess von Waldburg, remembered by history as Bauernjorg, Peasants' George, a name soaked in irony and blood. The contrast between the two sides could not have been more extreme. The peasants carried scythes, clubs, flails, and farm tools hammered into crude weapons. Their leadership was fragmented, their discipline shaky. Many believed divine protection would shield them from harm. Some marched into battle singing hymns. The knights marched in silence. The decisive confrontations came quickly and brutally. One of the most infamous occurred near Frankenhausen in May 1525. There, tens of thousands of peasants gathered on open ground, fortified only by wagons and shallow earthworks. Among them was Thomas Münzer, a radical preacher who believed the uprising was part of God's apocalyptic plan. He told them angels would stop enemy bullets in midair. They believed him. When the prince's forces arrived, they did not negotiate. Artillery opened fire almost immediately. Cannonballs tore through peasant ranks, shredding bodies, splintering wagons, and collapsing morale within minutes. Then came the cavalry charge. Armored knights thundered into panicked masses who had no formations, no training, and no protection. What followed was not combat, it was slaughter. Men were cut down as they ran. Others were trampled into the mud. Those who surrendered were executed on the spot. By the end of the day, over 5,000 peasants lay dead. The professional army lost fewer than 10 men, and Frankenhausen was only one battlefield. Across Germany, the pattern repeated again and again. At Leibheim, Böblingen, Weinsberg, and dozens of lesser-known villages, peasant armies collapsed under the weight of disciplined violence. Knights pursued fleeing rebels for miles, cutting them down long after any threat had vanished. Prisoners were tortured for information, then hanged, beheaded, or blinded. Entire villages were punished collectively, homes burned, livestock seized, women assaulted. By the summer of 1525, the rebellion was over. The cost was catastrophic. Modern historians estimate that between 60,000 and 100,000 peasants were killed, one of the deadliest popular uprisings in European history. In some regions, a third of the adult male population vanished in a single season. The victors showed no mercy. New laws tightened feudal control even further. Surviving rebels were branded, mutilated, or forced into lifelong servitude. The dream of reform was buried beneath mass graves. Perhaps the most tragic betrayal came not from princes, but from Martin Luther himself. Horrified by the violence, and terrified that social chaos would destroy his religious movement, Luther turned fiercely against the peasants. In a now infamous pamphlet, he urged rulers to stab, smite, and slay the rebels without mercy. To many peasants, it felt like God himself had turned against them. Thomas Münzer was captured, tortured, and executed. His head was displayed as a warning. The message was clear: challenge the social order, and you would be annihilated. Yet the Peasants' War did not vanish into silence. It left scars that never fully healed. Fear of popular revolt haunted European elites for centuries. Ideas of social justice, equality, and resistance did not die. They went underground, waiting for another moment. When revolutions finally erupted in France in 1789, historians would look back to 1525 and see it as a grim preview of what happens when desperation meets power. 4,000 knights did not defeat 60,000 peasants because they were braver, smarter, or more righteous. They won because they controlled violence, organization, and legitimacy. The peasants had numbers, faith, and fury. But in a world ruled by steel and hierarchy, that was not enough. The German Peasants' War stands as a warning written in blood. When peaceful demands are ignored, rebellion becomes inevitable. But when rebellion is crushed without mercy, the cost is measured not just in lives, but in centuries of silence. And in the fields where peasants once dreamed of freedom, the earth still remembers.